They found him by the smell of old wine and damp stone. An imperial patrol pried open the door of an abandoned villa's cellar, and their torches caught a trembling hand, a glass vial, and a face that looked too carefully arranged to belong to a boy. Sporus, barely 20, did not plead. He only watched the torchlight flicker across the liquid that could carry him anywhere but the arena. If you care about stories that power tried to erase, hit like and subscribe now, because what follows is one of the cruelest edits power ever made to a human life. To understand this ending, you have to start at the moment an emperor decided that death was an insult he could correct. Rome, 65 AD. Nero, a man trained since childhood to believe that his will was law, lost the only person whose gaze made him feel like more than a costume, Poppaea Sabina. Whether it was a kick in rage or a beating he couldn't reverse, she died with their child inside her. Grief should have taught him limits. It taught him hunger. He embalmed her with oceans of spice, sealed her in crystal, spoke to her at dinner as if silence were just another courtier to be disciplined. And then he began to hunt, faces in crowds, fragments in mirrors, the tilt of a chin across a corridor. It wasn't love anymore, it was drafting. A designer sketching a replacement part for reality. The day he saw Sporus, a palace-born freedman with eyes that caught the lamplight the way Poppaea's once had, time didn't stop, it pivoted. Witnesses described the emperor circling the boy like a problem already solved. Name: Sporus. Function: to be edited. The court understood at once. This was no dalliance. This was a project. Artists arrived first, not to paint but to measure, angles of cheek and brow, how a smile lived and died at the corner of the mouth. Tutors came next to sand the voice, narrow the step, rehearse the laughter. Physicians followed with steel and poppy wine. The work had a vocabulary, adjust, refine, perfect, words that make cruelty sound like craftsmanship. And because it is easier to live beside evil than to die resisting it, the palace complied. Servants learned new titles. Seamstresses rebuilt old gowns to new proportions. Poets rehearsed the epithalamium they would pretend to mean. Sporus didn't vanish in a single moment. He thinned. Every morning he was invited to stand before polished bronze and agree to be a little less himself. Sometimes that is how power destroys, not with one blow, but with 1,000 tiny signatures. Remember this cellar. Remember the vial. We are not watching a scandal. We are watching a blueprint. How a state can turn grief into policy, art into anesthesia, and a person into a role. In the next section. What does it take to erase a person? Not in death, but in life. While they still breathe, still move, still dream. For Sporus, it began with a gaze. When Nero's eyes found him across the marble hall, the boy's fate was sealed. The emperor did not see a servant. He saw a draft, a sketch of his dead empress. And in that instant, Sporus was no longer a name. He was raw material. The first tools weren't scalpels but sketches. Artists were ordered to study him as if he were clay. They mapped the slope of his cheekbones, the amber flecks in his irises, the nervous tilt of his head. Every angle was compared to Poppaea. Every difference became a flaw to be corrected. When their drawings displeased Nero, he raged. How could charcoal and wax capture what he demanded? An apparition resurrected. Yet the artists kept drawing, because to refuse was to die. Then came the tutors. Their assignment wasn't knowledge but erasure. Sporus was drilled in the feminine walk, the swaying steps of a matron. His voice was tested like an instrument, tuned higher and softer until even laughter rang false. He rehearsed Poppaea's phrases, her tones, the precise way she addressed senators and slaves alike. His own speech, his own sound, was buried under performance. The palace became complicit. Servants who once called him boy, now addressed him as lady. Seamstresses sewed dresses from Poppaea's patterns, draping silk and purple wool over a frame that still bore the shape of youth. Jewelers reset imperial ornaments to fit his body. Cooks seasoned his meals according to Poppaea's tastes, forcing even his tongue to forget itself. Imagine waking each day to find not one thing, not clothes, not words, not even the food in your mouth, belonging to you anymore. Finally, the physicians. Threatened with death and promised riches, they prepared their chambers. History spares us most of the details, but one thing is certain, Sporus did not emerge intact. Castration was only the beginning. The screams carried through stone walls. The recovery left him weak, drugged, broken. Yet Nero visited daily, whispering that birth always hurts, that what survives is beautiful. He spoke like a lover, but he acted like an artist shaping marble. And all the while, the court applauded. Senators bowed, priests blessed, servants obeyed. Not because they believed, but because survival demanded they play along. Power doesn't just create delusions, it recruits accomplices. And slowly, Sporus himself began to disappear, replaced by the ghost his emperor demanded. 6 months after the knives and the poppy wine, Rome was invited to a wedding. The emperor, clothed in purple and pride, announced that his bride would be none other than Sabina, Poppaea reborn. But the figure who walked beside him that day was not a woman at all. It was Sporus, veiled in saffron silk, painted in ceremonial cosmetics, his every gesture choreographed to mimic a ghost. The city understood what was being demanded of them. Senators who had whispered of Nero's madness now raised their voices in praise. Priests performed the rituals with trembling hands. Foreign envoys bowed as if nothing about this spectacle contradicted nature, law, or dignity. To decline the invitation was to invite death. So they applauded, and Rome became an accomplice. The procession wound through streets strewn with flowers, incense thick in the air. Sporus, hidden behind the bridal veil, carried not the joy of a union but the weight of an empire's silence. Contracts were signed, dowries exchanged, fertility charms presented in mockery of what everyone knew could never be. And when Nero carried his bride across the threshold, the crowd cheered as though they had witnessed a miracle instead of a crime. But the charade did not end at the altar. It deepened. At dinners, Sporus reclined in the empress's place. At the theater, he sat in the empress's box. At the games, he was paraded through the streets in the empress's litter. The people stared, half in awe, half in horror, at this impossible creature, a boy made into a widow, a servant forced into sainthood. Rome had always loved spectacle, and Nero gave them one drenched in madness. Behind the curtains, the cruelty was more intimate. Nero demanded that Sporus not just look like Poppaea, but be her. He had to know her jokes, her memories, her preferences in bed. He was expected to respond with rehearsed tenderness, to laugh at jokes he had never heard, to reenact affections that had belonged to another life. Every slip, every lapse into himself, risked punishment, not with fists, but with cold withdrawal, with threats to replace him, with the knowledge that even his survival depended on flawless performance. And yet, fragments of the boy remained. Courtiers recorded flashes of wit, moments when his true voice cut through the training. They saw the sadness in his eyes when the mask slipped. But those glimpses were dangerous. They reminded everyone that beneath the costume was not a goddess restored, but a human being stolen. By the spring of 68 AD, the empire itself was unraveling. Provinces rebelled, the Senate turned against its ruler, and the once loyal Praetorian Guard abandoned him. Nero, the man who had once commanded the world, was now a fugitive. Yet even in exile, he refused to part with the illusion he had built. Among the handful who followed him into hiding was Sporus, the living echo of Poppaea Sabina. Nero could not face the end without the ghost he had created. In a villa outside Rome, the emperor's final days played out more like theater than reality. He swung between desperate schemes of escape and melancholy rehearsals for death. Through it all, he clung to Sporus, addressing him as my only love, my resurrection, and asking that they remain together until the very end. When capture became inevitable, Nero finally chose to end his life. Sporus stood beside him, still bound to the role history had forced upon him, watching the emperor's last act on the stage of his own downfall. With Nero's death, you might expect Sporus's nightmare to end. Instead, it continued, reshaped, but no less heavy. Rome was entering the year of the 4 emperors, a time of chaos when generals fought for the throne. Each man who seized power inherited not just the empire, but its symbols. And Sporus, more than anyone else, had become a symbol of Nero's excesses, of Rome's complicity, of the fragility of identity under absolute power. Galba treated him with polite detachment, neither honoring nor freeing him. Otho, who had once been married to Poppaea before Nero took her, regarded Sporus with unsettling familiarity, as though the boy carried echoes of his own past. But the greatest burden came with Vitellius, whose reign was short yet harsh. He imagined Sporus as part of a public display meant to amuse the crowds. For someone who had already lived years as a performance, this new role was too much to bear. Faced with a future that promised only further spectacle, Sporus made his own decision. Ancient sources disagree on the details, but they agree on this: he refused to let others dictate his final chapter. At around 20 years old, he chose an end on his own terms. After a life where almost nothing had belonged to him, not his name, not his body, not even his voice, this single act was finally his. The story of Sporus is not only a tragedy but a mirror. It reflects how power can bend reality, how entire societies participate in illusions to protect themselves, and how one life can be erased in service to another's obsession. Yet within the silence of his last decision, there lingers a spark of agency, a reminder that even when stripped of everything, the human spirit still seeks a moment of truth.